Imagine a night in the Philippine provinces, deep in the interior of Mindanao or the mountain forests of the Visayas, where the modern world has not yet carved its certainty into the ancient landscape. The darkness here is not the comfortable darkness of a city where streetlights hold back the unknown, but something older, something vast and breathing. The jungle at night becomes a cathedral of sound. The rhythmic pulse of cicadas, the distant call of the Philippine eagle owl, the rustle of unseen things moving through the understory where ferns grow as tall as a man and the air itself feels thick with moisture and memory. This is liminal territory, the threshold between the ordered world of villages and rice terraces and the untamed realm where different laws apply. The forest paths here are not paved roads, but narrow trails worn by generations of feet, winding between massive dipterocarp trees whose roots grip the earth like the fingers of giants. During daylight, these paths serve as arteries of commerce and connection, linking remote barangays to market towns, carrying farmers and fishermen, students and merchants. But when the sun drops behind the western mountains and the sky bleeds from orange to purple to absolute black, these same paths transform into something else entirely. The temperature drops, not dramatically, but enough to feel the shift. And with it comes the mist. It rises from the streams and rivers that lace through the jungle like veins, creeping between tree trunks, obscuring vision beyond a few meters. The moon, when it appears through breaks in the canopy, casts a silver light that seems to drain color from the world, turning everything into shades of gray and shadow. This is the hour when sensible people remain in their homes, when windows are shuttered and doors are bolted, when prayers are said and rosaries are held. This is the hour when the boundary between what is and what should not be grows dangerously thin. You are walking alone on such a path, and perhaps you have good reason. A sick relative in the next village, an obligation that could not wait until morning, a journey that took longer than planned. The reasons matter less than the reality. You are here, in the deep forest, in the deep night, and you are alone. Your flashlight beam cuts through the darkness, illuminating a cone of path ahead. But it also makes everything beyond that cone seem darker by comparison. The sounds of the forest surround you, familiar yet somehow alien in this context. And you walk quickly, not quite running, but not dawdling either. Then you hear it. Faint at first, so faint you might convince yourself it is merely the wind or a night bird you do not recognize. But it persists, and as you continue walking, it grows clearer. It is a cry. Not the cry of an animal, but something unmistakably human, unmistakably infantile. A baby is crying somewhere in the forest ahead of you, and the sound carries through the mist with terrible clarity. The cry is not constant, but comes in waves, the particular cadence of a newborn in distress, a rising wail that peaks and breaks, followed by gasping breaths, then rising again. It is the sound that triggers something primal in the human nervous system, something that transcends culture and reason. It is the sound of helplessness, of vulnerability, of a life in immediate danger. Every instinct you possess screams at you to respond, to move toward that sound, to help. Because that is what humans do. That is what separates us from the indifferent forest. We answer the cries of the defenseless. But there is something else beneath that instinct. Something quieter, but no less insistent. It is the accumulated wisdom of generations who have walked these paths before you. encoded in stories told by grandmothers, in warnings passed from parent to child, in the specific quality of fear that enters a room when certain names are spoken. You have heard those stories. Everyone who grows up in these provinces has heard them. You know what cries in the Philippine forest at night. You know what waits for those who answer. The creature you are hearing, whether you choose to acknowledge it or not, is called the Tiyanak. It is one of the most psychologically insidious entities in Southeast Asian folklore, a being that weaponizes the very foundation of human empathy and social cohesion. Unlike monsters that inspire fear through size or obvious threat, the Tiyanak operates through inversion, through the corruption of trust. It transforms our greatest strength, our capacity for compassion, into our most dangerous vulnerability. The Tiyanak appears as a newborn child, abandoned in the forest or on a roadside, crying with perfect mimicry of infant distress. The appearance is flawless, the proportions correct, the skin tone appropriate, the movements convincingly infantile. There is no immediate sign of wrongness, no obvious tell that would trigger alarm. The creature understands, with a predator's precision, that the image of an abandoned baby bypasses rational thought entirely. It speaks directly to the limbic system, to the parts of the brain that evolved to ensure the survival of our young. To see a baby in danger and not respond is to violate something fundamental in our programming. But this is not a baby. This is something ancient and malevolent, something that takes the form of innocence specifically to destroy those who embody the values of human civilization. The Tiyanak is patient. It will cry for hours if necessary, modulating its wails to maintain urgency without becoming suspicious. It calculates distance and timing, allowing its victim to approach at their own pace, never rushing the deception. The creature is particularly drawn to women, especially those of childbearing age, because the maternal instinct provides an even stronger hook than general compassion. The origins of the Tiyanak are contested, varying across regions and influenced by centuries of cultural evolution and religious syncretism. What remains consistent across all versions is the fundamental of the creature as a liminal being, something caught between life and death, between human and demon, between the natural world and the supernatural realm. It is born from tragedy, from death that came too soon, from souls that were denied proper passage. And from that tragedy, it has become something that perpetuates tragedy, a feedback loop of grief and violence that has persisted for centuries in the collective consciousness of the Filipino people. Standing on that forest path, hearing that crime pierce through the darkness, you are caught in a moment that has repeated itself countless times throughout history. Travelers before you have stood exactly where you stand now, have heard exactly what you hear now, and have faced the same terrible choice. Do you move toward the sound, risking whatever horror might await? Or do you harden your heart against the cry and continue walking, knowing you might be abandoning an actual child to death? There is no good answer. There is only the decision you make, the consequences that follow. The cry continues, echoing through the mist-draped trees, a sound that should not exist in this place, at this hour. And you realize, with a cold certainty that settles in your chest like a stone, that you are about to learn whether the old stories are simply stories or whether the boundary between myth and reality is far thinner than you ever wanted to believe. The forest watches. The mist swirls. And somewhere ahead, in the darkness just beyond the reach of your flashlight, something that wears the face of innocence waits with infinite patience for you to come closer. Before we go deeper into this nightmare, I need you to understand something. If you are finding value in this journey through the shadows of Philippine folklore, if these stories resonate with the part of you that knows the old myths still matter, then I need you to become part of this community. Subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell. Because what we are building here is more than just entertainment. We are preserving cultural memory, documenting the fears and wisdom of our ancestors, ensuring that these stories survive into the modern age. Your subscription matters. Your engagement matters. We have more creatures to uncover, more nightmares to analyze, and I need you with me for every step of this journey. Do not simply watch passively. Commit. Join us. And then share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me, have you ever heard something crying in the forest at night? Did you investigate? Or did you walk away? Your experiences matter. Your stories add to the collective understanding of these phenomena. So subscribe, comment, and let us continue this exploration together. The genius of the Tiyanak lies not in its monstrous final form, but in the absolute perfection of its initial disguise. To understand the true horror of this creature, you must first appreciate the meticulous precision with which it mimics human infancy. The flawless replication of every detail that signals vulnerability and triggers our deepest protective instincts. This is not crude shape-shifting or magical illusion that crumbles under scrutiny, but rather a biological masterwork of deception that can withstand even close examination until the moment of transformation. When you encounter the Tiyanak in its hunting form, you see an infant that appears to be between newborn and perhaps 3 months old. The size is correct, measuring roughly 45 to 60 centimeters in length, with the proportional body structure of a human baby. The oversized head that comprises roughly 1/4 of total body length, the short limbs with their characteristic rolls of baby fat, the rounded belly. The skin tone varies depending on regional manifestations, but it consistently matches the complexion common to Filipino infants in that area, ensuring nothing appears immediately foreign or suspect. The face is perhaps the most sophisticated element of the disguise. The features are soft and undefined in the way that newborn faces are, with the characteristic flatness of the nasal bridge, the full cheeks, the small chin. The eyes, when they open between cries, appear dark and unfocused, lacking the ability to track movement or fix on objects in the manner consistent with very young infants, whose visual systems are still developing. The fontanelles, the soft spots on an infant's skull where the bones have not yet fused, are present and can be felt if one were foolish enough to touch the creature's head. Even the fine details are accurate. The tiny fingernails, the creases in the palms, the way the fingers curl reflexively when touched. The creature's body temperature reads as human, warm to the touch in a way that suggests recent care and feeding. There is no coldness, no clammy quality that might trigger alarm. If you were to pick up the Tiyanak before its transformation, you would feel appropriate weight, appropriate warmth, appropriate softness. The simulation extends to breathing patterns, to the rise and fall of the chest, to the subtle movements of sleep or distress that characterize infant behavior. Nothing in the visual or tactile presentation betrays the supernatural of what you are holding. But it is the cry, above all else, that represents the Tiyanak's most devastating weapon. The sound is engineered, whether through supernatural intelligence or evolutionary adaptation, to exploit specific vulnerabilities in human neurological and emotional architecture. The cry of a human infant operates at a frequency range between 300 and 500 hertz. with a fundamental pitch that varies, but typically centers around 400 to 450 Hz. This frequency range has been demonstrated through numerous studies to trigger immediate physiological responses in adults, particularly women. Elevated heart rate, increased blood pressure, heightened alertness, and most critically, an overwhelming compulsion to respond and provide care. The Tiyanak's cry replicates this frequency with perfect accuracy. But beyond mere acoustic mimicry, it understands the semiotics of infant distress, the coded language that babies use to communicate need. Human infants cry differently depending on whether they are hungry, in pain, tired, or simply seeking comfort. Each type of cry has a distinct pattern, rhythm, and intensity. The Tiyanak most commonly employs what child development researchers call the pain cry, a sudden, loud onset with a long initial cry lasting several seconds, followed by a period of breath holding, then shorter, more frequent cries, with visible and audible gasping for breath between vocalizations. This particular cry pattern triggers the most intense response in adult caregivers because it signals immediate danger to the infant. It is the cry that accompanies injury, illness, or acute distress, and it demands instant intervention. The Tiyanak knows this. It modulates the intensity carefully, loud enough to be heard from significant distances through dense forest, but not so constant or mechanical that it loses the organic quality of genuine distress. There are variations in pitch and duration, moments where the cry seems to weaken as if the infant is exhausting itself, followed by renewed wails that suggest a desperate fight for survival. The psychological impact of this cry cannot be overstated. When you hear an infant in distress, your conscious reasoning faculties are bypassed almost entirely. The response is subcortical, originating in the oldest parts of the brain, the structures we share with other mammals who care for helpless young. Your body begins preparing to respond before you have consciously decided to do so. Stress hormones flood your system, your muscles tense for action, your attention narrows and focuses on the source of the sound. This is not weakness or foolishness. This is the biological foundation of human civilization, the mechanism that ensures we protect the vulnerable members of our species. For women, particularly those who have given birth or who are of childbearing age, the response is even more pronounced. The cry of a baby in distress can trigger the letdown reflex in nursing mothers, causing milk to begin flowing. Women report feeling physical pain in response to hearing infant cries, a visceral ache in the chest that some describe as unbearable. The Tiyanak targets this vulnerability with precision. Testimonies from rural provinces consistently report that women are more frequently victimized than men, and that the compulsion to respond to the cry feels almost physical, as if an invisible rope is pulling them toward the sound. The deception extends to the creature's apparent helplessness. If you approach and observe the Tiyanak from a distance before intervening, you will see appropriate infant behaviors. Flailing limbs moving without coordination, the head turning from side to side, the mouth opening wide with each cry in the characteristic square shape of infant distress. The baby appears to be lying on its back, unable to roll over or right itself, completely dependent on outside assistance. This reinforces every instinct to help, to rescue, to provide care. There are subtle tells, warnings that exist in the oral tradition passed down through generations, but they require knowledge to recognize and extraordinary self-control to heed. The elders say that the Tiyanak's cry has a quality that is described as too sharp, too insistent, with a wheedling undertone that genuine infant distress lacks. Human babies, even in pain, have moments where the cry breaks or softens. where exhaustion momentarily overwhelms distress. The Tiyanak maintains a more calculated consistency, a performance that is almost but not quite natural. But recognizing this difference requires you to suppress every instinct screaming at you to act, to instead stand still and analyze the acoustic properties of a baby's scream while that baby appears to be dying. The creature also lacks the accompanying signs that would normally surround an abandoned infant. There are no discarded cloths or blankets, no remnants of whoever left the child. The baby appears clean, not covered in the fluids and matter that would be present if it had truly been recently born and discarded. Its positioning is often too deliberate, placed directly in the path, rather than off to the side where someone might have laid it down. But these are details that require calm observation, and calm observation is nearly impossible when every fiber of your being is focused on ending the terrible sound of that cry. This, then, is the anatomy of innocence as weapon. The Tiyanak does not overpower its victims through size or strength. It does not hunt through stealth or speed. Instead, it converts the fundamental architecture of human empathy into a trap, using our own compassion as the mechanism of our destruction. It takes the thing that makes us human, our inability to ignore the suffering of the helpless, and transforms it into our greatest vulnerability. The creature understands, with a predator's clarity, that the shortest path to a victim is not through fear, but through love. Not through what we are afraid of, but through what we are willing to die for. And when you stand on that dark path, hearing that perfect cry pierce through the night, you are confronting a choice that has no good answer. Because even knowing what the Tiyanak is, even understanding the mechanism of its deception, the cry still works. Your body still responds. Your heart still breaks at the sound of that suffering. And part of you will always wonder, what if this time it is real? What if this time there truly is a baby dying in the forest, and your knowledge of mythology, your caution, your fear, causes you to walk away and let an innocent die? The Tiyanak does not just hunt bodies, it hunts the soul, forcing you to choose between self-preservation and the moral foundations of human civilization. And that choice, that terrible choice, is where the real horror lives. To understand the Tiyanak, you must first travel to the mountainous interior of Mindanao, to the territories of the Mandaya people, where the oldest version of this creature's origin is preserved in oral tradition that predates Spanish colonization by centuries. Here, in communities scattered across the eastern slopes of the Pacific Cordillera, the Tiyanak is not merely a monster, but a tragedy made manifest. A being whose existence speaks to the fundamental relationship between life, death, and the earth itself in indigenous Philippine cosmology. This is the story of souls caught between states of being, of lives that never reached completion, and of the terrible consequences when the natural order of birth and death is disrupted. In Mandaya understanding, the process of human life follows a sacred trajectory that must be completed properly for the soul to achieve its rightful place in the cosmic order. Conception begins a journey that requires specific stages: growth within the mother's womb, emergence into the world of air and light, the first breath that animates the body with independent life, and eventually the full integration into the community through naming and recognition. Each stage is marked by ritual and protected by ancestral spirits who oversee the transition from one state to the next. But when this trajectory is interrupted, when death intercepts the process before completion, the soul becomes trapped in a liminal state, unable to move forward or back. The Mandaya origin of the Tiyanak describes a specific and particularly tragic form of this interruption. A child whose mother dies while pregnant, before labor has begun. The mother's death means the child cannot be born in the natural way, through the body that carried it. But the child's spirit has already achieved sufficient formation to possess consciousness and awareness, enough to know that it should have been born, that it was meant to exist in the world. The soul is trapped, fully formed, but without the possibility of completing its journey into life. According to the tradition, when a pregnant woman dies and is buried, her unborn child does not simply cease to exist. The soul remains tethered to the location of burial, to the earth that now surrounds what should have been its pathway to life. Over time, over days or weeks or months, depending on the telling, something happens in that grave. The earth itself, which in Mandaya cosmology is not dead matter, but a living force with its own form of consciousness, responds to the presence of this trapped soul. The soil becomes the womb that the original mother can no longer be. And from that soil, the child is born again, but born wrong, born into a state that is neither fully alive nor fully dead. This is what it means to be born in the ground. The child emerges not through flesh, but through earth, not into light and air, but into darkness and soil. The process inverts everything that should be natural about birth. Where a human mother's body provides warmth and nourishment and connection, the earth provides only coldness and isolation. Where human birth brings the child into community and relationship, earth birth creates a being fundamentally separated from human society, able to mimic it, but never truly belong to it. The Tiyanak, in this understanding, is not evil by choice, but by circumstance, not malevolent by, but transformed by the wrongness of its genesis. The physical characteristics of the Tiyanak, in this origin story, make sense as adaptations to its earth birth. The gray tone that some descriptions attribute to its true form reflects the color of the soil from which it emerged. The ability to remain motionless for extended periods mirrors the patience of the earth itself. The creature's connection to forests and wilderness areas represents its inability to enter human spaces properly, its fundamental alienation from the communities it can observe but never join. Even its hunting behavior, luring travelers into isolated areas, can be understood as a grotesque parody of seeking the human connection it was denied by its premature death. But there is another layer to this origin story that speaks to the profound sophistication of Mandaya spiritual understanding. The Tiyanak is not simply a victim of circumstance. The tradition holds that the manner of its birth in the ground transforms the soul itself, corrupting it with grief and rage and hunger that cannot be satisfied. The child's spirit remembers, in some fundamental way, what was taken from it. The mother's heartbeat that suddenly stopped, the warmth that grew cold, the expectation of life that turned to death. This memory, this knowledge of having been denied existence, becomes the core of the Tiyanak's identity. The creature's targeting of travelers, particularly women of childbearing age, takes on deeper meaning in this context. It is not random predation, but a form of grief made predatory. The Tiyanak seeks what it was denied: maternal care, the experience of being held and comforted, the feeling of being wanted and protected. But because it was born wrong, because the earth gave it form but not humanity, it cannot receive these things even when offered. The moment of transformation, when the compassionate rescuer becomes a victim, represents the Tiyanak's realization that what it seeks can never be obtained, that the gap between what it is and what it should have been cannot be bridged. The violence that follows is the expression of that realization, rage at the impossibility of redemption. This cosmology reveals something crucial about pre-colonial Philippine understanding of the relationship between humans and the natural world. The earth is not passive or neutral, but actively participatory in the cycle of life and death. It can give birth after a fashion, but the life it produces is fundamentally different from human life. The boundary between these two forms of existence must be maintained through proper ritual and proper completion of life stages. When that boundary is violated, when souls become caught in the space between, the results are catastrophic, not just for the individual, but for the entire community. The Mandaya tradition includes specific rituals designed to prevent this transformation. When a pregnant woman dies, there are ceremonies that must be performed to release the child's soul, to ensure it does not remain trapped in the grave. These rituals involve prayers spoken directly to the earth, asking it not to receive the child's spirit, combined with offerings meant to appease the spirits who oversee transitions between life and death. The woman's body would be positioned in specific ways, with certain plants and objects placed around her, creating a spiritual barrier that prevents the wrong kind of birth from occurring. These practices demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of spiritual anatomy, of the mechanics by which souls interact with physical matter. Yet despite these protections, the persistence of Tiyanak stories suggests that the rituals were not always successful or not always performed. Pregnant women died in childbirth, during illness, from accidents in the forest or fields. Not every death occurred in circumstances where proper ritual could be conducted. The bodies of women who died alone, whose graves were unmarked, or whose burials were hurried due to circumstances, would be particularly vulnerable to producing Tiyanaks. This created a perpetual source of potential transformation, a steady emergence of these creatures from the earth itself. The tragedy of the Tiyanak, in this origin story, extends beyond the creature itself to encompass everyone involved. The mother who died with her child, still unborn, denied the experience of meeting the life she carried. The child whose potential was cut short before it could begin. The travelers who respond to the cry with genuine compassion only to be destroyed for that compassion. And even the Tiyanak itself, trapped in a form of existence that brings only suffering to itself and others, unable to die properly because it was never properly born, unable to live because it is fundamentally not alive in the way humans are alive. This is the cosmology that the Mandaya people preserved and passed down through generations. Not a simple ghost story or monster tale, but a complex spiritual teaching about the importance of proper transitions, the dangers of interruption in sacred processes, and the terrible consequences when souls become trapped between states of being. The Tiyanak, born from the ground rather than from flesh, stands as a warning about the fragility of the boundary between life and death, and as a reminder that some tragedies echo far beyond their original occurrence, creating ripples of suffering that persist for generations in the forests where the earth has given birth to grief itself. In the year 1521, Spanish galleons arrived in the Philippine archipelago carrying not only soldiers and trade goods, but an entire cosmological framework that would fundamentally reshape indigenous spiritual beliefs. The Catholic Church, operating as the spiritual arm of colonial conquest, brought with it a particular anxiety about unbaptized souls, a theological concern that would find fertile ground in existing Filipino folklore and ultimately transform the Tiyanak from a tragic earthborn spirit into something far more insidious. A cautionary tale about religious duty, a weapon of social control disguised as supernatural threat. This is the story of how colonization operates not just through military force, but through the colonization of fear itself. The strategic merger of indigenous mythology with imported doctrine to create hybrid creatures that serve the interests of the occupying power. Catholic theology, as interpreted and enforced by Spanish missionaries in the 16th and 17th centuries, held a particularly rigid view of salvation that created urgent stakes around the sacrament of baptism. According to church doctrine, original sin tainted every human soul from the moment of conception, a spiritual corruption inherited from the first humans that could only be cleansed through baptism. Unbaptized souls, regardless of the individual's actions or character, were barred from heaven and confined to limbo, an eternal state of separation from God. For infants who died before baptism, this meant permanent exclusion from salvation despite having committed no personal sins, a theological position that generated enormous anxiety among Catholic parents and provided powerful motivation for ensuring baptism occurred as quickly as possible after birth. The missionaries who arrived in the Philippines recognized immediately that indigenous populations already possessed sophisticated spiritual frameworks that included beliefs about souls, the afterlife, and the consequences of improper death, rather than attempting to completely erase these beliefs, which would have been both practically difficult and strategically inefficient. The Church engaged in what scholars of religious studies call syncretism, the strategic merging of indigenous and Catholic elements to create hybrid belief systems that served colonial purposes while maintaining enough familiar elements to achieve local acceptance. The Tiyanak represented a perfect candidate for this theological renovation. The existing Mandaya belief in earthborn spirits of unborn children provided the foundation, but Spanish missionaries introduced a crucial modification. The cause of transformation was not the circumstances of death, but the absence of baptism. In this Christianized version, any infant who died before receiving the sacrament was at risk of becoming a Tiyanak, regardless of whether death occurred in the womb, during birth, or in the days following. The transformation was presented not as a natural consequence of interrupted life processes, but as a form of spiritual damnation, the soul's corruption by its unbaptized state manifesting as physical monstrosity. This theological reframing served multiple colonial purposes simultaneously. It created urgent pressure on Filipino converts to baptize their children immediately, ideally within days of birth, ensuring that families remained connected to the Church and subject to its authority. It positioned the Church as the sole protection against a terrifying supernatural threat, making religious obedience synonymous with family safety. And perhaps most insidiously, it transformed indigenous spiritual beliefs from competing religious frameworks into cautionary tales that reinforced Catholic doctrine, allowing the Church to claim it was not destroying Filipino culture, but rather purifying it, revealing the Christian truth that had always been hidden within indigenous mythology. The syncretic Tiyanak that emerged from this colonial process possessed characteristics drawn from both traditions, creating a creature more complex and more threatening than either source alone. From indigenous beliefs came the physical manifestation, the hunting techniques, the association with forests and liminal spaces, the targeting of travelers. From Catholic doctrine came the theological framework, the emphasis on baptism as protection, the concept of spiritual corruption manifesting as physical transformation, the notion that proper ritual could prevent the horror. The result was a being that operated simultaneously in indigenous and Catholic cosmological frameworks, a monster that made sense to both the colonized and the colonizer, though for very different reasons. In practical terms, this meant that Filipino families in the colonial period faced a form of spiritual terrorism enforced through both institutional church authority and community belief systems. Every infant death became a potential source of future Tiyanaks, Every delay in baptism, a risk that could haunt the family for generations. Parents who lost unbaptized children carried not only the grief of loss, but the fear that their child's spirit had been transformed into something malevolent, that the baby they mourned might be actively hunting and killing other members of the community. This created a feedback loop of guilt, fear, and religious compliance that served colonial interests perfectly. The church explicitly encouraged these beliefs through sermons, through the training of local religious leaders, through the strategic deployment of missionary resources to areas where infant mortality was highest, and thus where fear of Tiyanaks would be most intense. Parish records from the 17th and 18th centuries show priests documenting Tiyanak sightings and explicitly connecting them to families who had been lax in their religious duties, who had delayed baptism or failed to attend Mass regularly. The supernatural threat became a tool of social control, a way of enforcing orthodoxy through the mobilization of cultural fears. But syncretism is never a one-way process, and Filipino communities did not simply absorb Catholic doctrine passively. The Christianized Tiyanak also incorporated elements that subtly resisted colonial power, even as it appeared to reinforce church authority. The creature's targeting of travelers, for instance, could be read as attacking the mobile agents of colonialism, the Spanish officials, the missionaries themselves, the Filipino collaborators who moved between communities spreading colonial influence. The fact that traditional Filipino protective methods, reversing clothing, using indigenous plants and materials, remained effective against the Christianized Tiyanak suggested that indigenous spiritual knowledge retained power, even in a Catholic framework. Moreover, the Tiyanak served as a repository for grief and trauma that colonial society provided no legitimate outlet for expressing. Infant mortality rates in the colonial Philippines were catastrophically high, with estimates suggesting that between 30% and 40% of children died before age 5. The causes were numerous: disease, malnutrition, complications from childbirth in circumstances where medical care was minimal or non-existent, violence associated with colonial conflicts. Families needed ways to process this loss, to make sense of suffering that seemed arbitrary and overwhelming. The Catholic Church offered extremely limited comfort for these deaths, particularly when the child had not been baptized. Church doctrine held that unbaptized infants could not enter heaven, could not be saved, existed in a state of permanent separation from God and from the family members who would eventually achieve salvation. This was cold comfort at best, spiritual cruelty at worst. The Tiyanak mythology, even in its Christianized form, provided an alternative narrative. The child did not simply cease to exist, but continued in some form, possessed agency and power, remained connected to the world, even if that connection was hostile. This is the paradox at the heart of the syncretic Tiyanak, a creature that simultaneously enforces colonial religious control and provides psychological relief from the consequences of colonial conditions. It terrifies families into baptizing their children while also acknowledging that death and grief are forces that cannot be contained by ritual alone. It positions the church as protector while also suggesting that indigenous spiritual practices retain efficacy. It transforms lost children into monsters while also granting them a form of continued existence that church doctrine denied. By the 19th and 20th centuries, as the Philippines moved through late Spanish colonialism and into American occupation and eventual independence, the Tiyanak had become thoroughly embedded in Filipino consciousness as a syncretic entity whose origins in colonial power dynamics had largely been forgotten. It was simply part of the cultural landscape, a creature that everyone knew, that required no explanation, that existed in the space where indigenous and Catholic beliefs had merged so completely that separating them was no longer possible or particularly meaningful. Yet understanding this origin remains crucial because it reveals how colonization operates not just through obvious violence, but through the subtle reshaping of cultural imagination, through the strategic deployment of fear, through the creation of hybrid belief systems that serve power while appearing to honor tradition. The Tiyanak is not just a monster in the forest. It is a monument to the mechanisms of colonial control, a reminder that the most effective forms of domination are those that convince the dominated to police themselves, to internalize the fears and anxieties that serve their oppressors, to transform their own cultural heritage into weapons against their own communities. The unbaptized child crying in the darkness is not just seeking victims. It is calling out the history of how belief itself becomes colonized, how fear becomes faith, how grief becomes guilt in the service of powers that claim to offer salvation while delivering only submission. To dismiss the Tiyanak as a mindless monster driven by instinct alone is to fundamentally misunderstand of this predator and to dramatically underestimate the danger it represents. The creature operates according to what can only be described as a sophisticated hunting protocol, a systematic methodology that demonstrates not only intelligence, but a profound understanding of human psychology, behavioral patterns, and decision-making processes under stress. This is not random violence, but calculated predation, refined over centuries of successful kills into a nearly perfect system for converting human compassion into human corpses. The hunt begins long before the cry is ever heard, with a critical phase of target selection and environmental staging. The Tiyanak does not appear randomly in the forest, but positions itself with strategic precision at locations where specific criteria are met. The creature seeks paths that are well-traveled enough to ensure regular victims, but isolated enough to prevent interference or rescue. It favors sections of trail that bend or curve, where a traveler cannot see more than 20 or 30 meters ahead or behind, creating a psychological bubble of isolation even on routes that connect populated areas. The topography matters. The Tiyanak prefers slightly elevated positions where the cry will carry farther, where the acoustic properties of the landscape amplify the sound while making it difficult to pinpoint the exact source. Timing is equally calculated. The creature hunts primarily during the transitional hours of dusk and dawn, what wildlife biologists call crepuscular periods, when human vision is compromised but not completely absent. Total darkness would make travelers too cautious, too alert to danger, moving quickly and avoiding investigation of unusual sounds. Full daylight would allow too much visibility, too much ability to assess the situation from a safe distance. But the gray light of early morning or late evening provides the perfect balance. Enough illumination to see that there appears to be an infant, enough shadow to prevent careful examination of details that might reveal wrongness, enough ambient sound from awakening or settling wildlife to provide acoustic camouflage for any inconsistencies in the cry. The Tiyanak also demonstrates sophisticated understanding of human scheduling and motivation. It positions itself on routes during times when people are most likely to be traveling alone. Farmers heading to distant fields before dawn, workers returning home after late shifts, individuals traveling to visit relatives or fulfill obligations that require solitary journeys. The creature seems to recognize that groups provide both moral support and practical protection, that people in company are more likely to discuss unusual situations and make collective decisions rather than impulsive individual responses. The solitary traveler, conversely, has only their own judgment to rely on, faces the moral burden of decision alone, and cannot distribute the psychological weight of ignoring a crying infant across multiple consciences. Once positioned, the Tiyanak enters what might be termed the attraction phase, the deployment of the cry itself as both lure and weapon. But the creature does not simply begin wailing at maximum volume and maintain constant noise. Instead, it modulates the vocalization with remarkable sophistication, creating a narrative arc within the sound itself that tells a story of escalating distress and implies a timeline that pressures the victim toward immediate action. The cry typically begins relatively soft and intermittent, as if the infant has been crying for some time and is beginning to exhaust itself, the sound of a baby whose strength is failing. This establishes urgency without triggering immediate suspicion, suggests that time is running out, that delay could mean death. As the traveler draws closer, the Tiyanak shifts the pattern. The cries become more frequent and slightly louder, as if the infant senses potential rescue and is rallying its remaining strength to signal for help. This change rewards the traveler's approach, provides positive reinforcement that they are doing the right thing, that their compassion is justified and necessary. The psychological effect is powerful. The victim is not merely hearing a cry, but participating in what feels like a developing rescue scenario, a narrative where they are the hero arriving just in time. This emotional investment makes it increasingly difficult to turn back, even if doubts begin to surface. The Tiyanak also demonstrates adaptive behavior, modifying its approach based on the victim's response. If the traveler calls out, asking if someone is there or if the baby is all right, the creature will often pause briefly before resuming the cry, mimicking the way an infant might temporarily quiet at the sound of an adult voice before continuing to wail. This responsiveness to stimulus reinforces the illusion of genuine life, suggests consciousness and awareness rather than mechanical repetition. Some testimonies describe the cry seeming to move slightly, as if the infant is shifting position or being affected by wind, preventing the traveler from fixing on an exact location and forcing them to come closer to triangulate the source. The creature's understanding of maternal instinct is particularly sophisticated. Women, especially those who have given birth or who are of childbearing age, report that the cry triggers almost physical compulsion, a bodily response that overrides rational thought. The Tiyanak seems to recognize this, adjusting its vocalizations when female victims approach to incorporate specific elements that maximize maternal response, the particular pitch and rhythm associated with newborns rather than older infants, the sound of gasping between cries that suggests breathing difficulties, the occasional weakening of volume that implies consciousness is fading. These elements speak directly to the deepest evolutionary imperatives, the biological programming that ensured human infants received immediate care despite the enormous resource investment they required. But the Tiyanak's protocol extends beyond mere acoustic manipulation to include strategic management of the victim's psychological state throughout the approach. The creature maintains what psychologists would call optimal arousal, keeping the victim in a state of high emotional activation without tipping over into fight or flight panic that might trigger retreat. The cry is distressing, but not so horrifying that it suggests supernatural involvement. The situation is urgent, but not so impossibly dire that rescue seems futile. The creature is calibrating constantly, reading the victim's behavior, adjusting its performance to maintain forward momentum toward the moment of contact. This is where the Tiyanak's intelligence is most evident, in its patience. The creature will maintain the deception for as long as necessary, sometimes for 30 minutes or more if the victim is particularly cautious or if the terrain makes approach difficult. It does not rush, does not make the mistake of desperation, that might create suspicion. Some accounts describe travelers who circled the area multiple times, trying to locate the source of the cry, with a Tiyanak adjusting its position slightly each time to remain just ahead, just out of sight, always drawing the victim deeper into the forest and farther from the safety of the main path. The creature also demonstrates understanding of human decision-making under moral pressure. It recognizes that many people, particularly those familiar with folklore, will experience doubt and fear, will struggle with the decision to investigate or ignore the cry. The Tiyanak exploits this internal conflict by maintaining the cry long enough that walking away begins to feel not like caution, but like moral failure, like murder by neglect. Every step the traveler takes away from the sound must be taken with the knowledge that if this is a real infant, it is dying because they chose safety over compassion. This is psychological warfare of the highest order, the weaponization of conscience itself. The protocol also includes contingency planning for victims who attempt to help without direct physical contact. If someone calls out that they are going to get help, that they will return with others, the Tiyanak will often intensify the cry dramatically, creating a sense that the infant cannot possibly survive the time it would take to fetch assistance, that leaving means arriving back to find a corpse. This forces the victim into a binary choice: leave and bear the guilt of probable death, or stay and provide immediate aid despite the fear. And for most people, for anyone who retains connection to the basic moral frameworks that allow human society to function, there is only one choice they can make. This is the genius of the Tiyanak's hunting protocol. It does not overpower the victim's judgment, but rather enlists that judgment as an accomplice in their own destruction. The creature provides just enough evidence of genuine distress to make helping seem reasonable, just enough urgency to prevent careful analysis, just enough emotional manipulation to transform caution into cruelty. It understands that humans are not purely rational actors, but social animals whose behavior is governed by emotion, instinct, moral frameworks, and the constant negotiation between self-preservation and group welfare. And it has learned, through centuries of successful predation, exactly how to exploit every vulnerability in that complex system, how to turn our greatest strengths into our fatal weaknesses, how to make love and compassion indistinguishable from the path to death. There is a specific moment in every Tiyanak encounter that represents the fulcrum point between two entirely different realities. The instant when compassion transforms into horror and when the rescuer becomes the victim. This moment of revelation is not gradual, but instantaneous. A switch thrown with such speed that the human mind struggles to process what is happening, even as the body begins to react. Understanding this transformation sequence is crucial, not merely for comprehending the Tiyanaks, but for grasping the psychological weapon it represents. The way it converts trust into trauma in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The transformation begins at the moment of contact, when the victim reaches down to pick up what they believe is an abandoned infant. Some testimonies describe the trigger as the instant fingers touch the creature's skin. Others suggest it occurs when the baby is lifted from the ground. Still others claim the Tiyanak waits until it is cradled against the victim's chest, held in the protective embrace that represents the ultimate expression of maternal or parental care. The variation in timing may reflect individual Tiyanak preferences, or may be strategic adaptation based on the victim's behavior and the environmental circumstances. What remains consistent is that the creature allows full commitment to the act of rescue before revealing its true story, ensuring the victim is physically and psychologically invested in the role of savior before destroying that role completely. The first sign of wrongness is often tactile rather than visual. The skin that should feel soft and warm suddenly registers as wrong. the texture shifting beneath the victim's hands in a way that human tissue cannot and should not move. Witnesses who survived encounters described the sensation as feeling the infant's flesh ripple and harden, as if the bones beneath were rearranging themselves, as if the entire structure of the body was reorganizing according to different anatomical rules. The temperature changes simultaneously, the warmth draining away or being replaced by a coldness that feels actively malevolent, that seems to pull heat from the victim's own body. The physical transformation follows within seconds, unfolding with a speed that prevents any possibility of dropping the creature and fleeing. The smooth skin of infancy darkens and toughens, taking on a gray or grayish-green tone that some describe as resembling stone or clay rather than living flesh. The texture becomes rough, almost scaly in some accounts, with a quality that suggests age rather than youth, corruption rather than innocence. The baby fat that gave the infant its characteristic roundness seems to collapse inward, revealing sharp angles and harsh contours beneath. The illusion of softness falling away to expose something fundamentally skeletal and predatory. The face undergoes the most dramatic and psychologically devastating transformation. The undefined features of the newborn sharpen and distort, the small nose flattening further while the nostrils flare wide, the mouth stretching beyond the normal proportions of human anatomy. The lips pull back to reveal teeth that are entirely wrong for an infant, or indeed for any human. Pointed and sharp, designed for tearing rather than nursing, arranged in rows that suggest predatory efficiency rather than the gentle gums of early childhood. Some testimonies describe these teeth as resembling those of deep-sea fish. Multiple rows of backwards curving fangs meant to prevent prey from escaping once bitten. The eyes, which moments before appeared dark and unfocused with infantile innocence, undergo perhaps the most horrifying change. They bulge outward, growing larger than any human eyes should be, and the color shifts to a burning red or yellow that seems to glow with internal light. These eyes are fully aware, fully intelligent, and filled with an emotion that witnesses struggle to articulate but consistently describe as a mixture of rage and satisfaction. The look of a predator that has successfully deceived its prey and is about to feed. There is recognition in those eyes, a terrible understanding that the creature knows exactly what it has done, knows the psychological violation it has perpetrated, and takes active pleasure in that violation. The hands that the victim is holding or that are being held transform with equal horror. The tiny fingers elongate and thin, the baby fingernails extending into claws that are described as black or dark gray, curved and sharp as razors. These claws emerge so quickly that they often draw first blood during the transformation itself, slicing into the victim's arms or chest as they extend, creating pain that serves both as weapon and as confirmation that this is not hallucination or nightmare, but physical reality. The grip of these transformed hands is described as impossibly strong, far beyond what the creature's size would suggest, clamping onto the victim with a force that bruises bone and makes escape through strength alone effectively impossible. The body's proportions shift in ways that violate the basic geometry of human anatomy. The head, already oversized for an infant, grows larger still while the torso elongates. The limbs extend but unevenly, with one leg often described as significantly shorter than the other, creating an asymmetry that is deeply unsettling to observe. That triggers instinctive recognition that this being operates according to different physical laws. Some accounts describe small horns or pointed protrusions emerging from the skull, while others mention ears that sharpen into points and draw back against the head like those of an angry animal. The transformation is accompanied by sound, though not the cry that lured the victim to this point. The Tiyanak's voice changes completely. The infant wail cutting off abruptly and being replaced by something that witnesses describe variously as a hiss, a growl, a clicking sound like insects, or a high-pitched shriek that seems designed to disorient and terrorize. Some testimonies mention laughter, a sound utterly inappropriate to the situation and to the form producing it. A cackling that suggests not just malevolence, but active enjoyment of the victim's horror and confusion. This vocalization serves multiple purposes. It announces the successful completion of the hunt. It provides acoustic cover for the victim's screams, and it reinforces the psychological dimension of the attack, making clear that this is not mindless predation, but calculated cruelty. The entire transformation sequence, from first touch to full revelation, takes perhaps 3 to 5 seconds. This speed is crucial to the Tiyanak's success because it prevents the victim from responding effectively during the vulnerable period when the creature is shifting between forms. By the time the human brain has processed what is happening, by the time shock begins to give way to the possibility of action, the transformation is complete, and the attack is already underway. The victim is holding something that their eyes tell them is impossible. Their hands are injured by claws that appeared from nowhere, and their psychological state has shifted from compassionate rescuer to prey animal in less time than it takes to draw a full breath. The attack itself varies depending on the Tiyanak's objectives and the victim's response, but certain patterns recur across testimonies. The creature typically strikes first at the arms and chest, using its claws to inflict injuries that disable the victim's ability to fight back or escape. The targeting is precise, suggesting knowledge of human anatomy and vulnerability, going for areas rich in blood vessels, for joints that can be damaged to prevent flight, for the throat and face where injuries create maximum psychological as well as physical trauma. The teeth follow the claws, biting with a force that seems impossible for the creature's size, tearing rather than merely puncturing, creating wounds that are described as savage and animalistic. But perhaps the deepest wound is psychological rather than physical. The victim must process, in real time, that their compassion has been weaponized against them, that the moral framework they used to make the decision to help has led directly to their victimization. They must confront the fact that they were not wrong to want to help, not foolish to respond to a crying infant, but that, in this specific instance, their goodness has been exploited by something that understands goodness only as weakness to be consumed. This realization, occurring simultaneously with physical attack, can be as damaging as any claw wound, a form of spiritual injury that survivors carry long after physical wounds have healed. The moment of revelation, then, is not simply a physical transformation, but a metaphysical one. A ripping away of the veil between what we want the world to be and what it actually contains. It is the instant when we learn that monsters are real, that they are intelligent, that they understand us better than we understand them, and that they have learned to turn our virtues into vectors of attack. And in that terrible instant, as the gray flesh writhes in your hands and the red eyes blaze with triumphant malice, you understand that you are not the rescuer in this story. You never were. You are the prey, and you have been from the moment you first heard that cry echoing through the darkness. The Tiyanak is not merely historical curiosity or fading superstition confined to dusty archives and academic papers. In the rural provinces of the Visayas and Mindanao regions, the creature remains a living presence in contemporary consciousness, reported with enough consistency and specificity that dismissing these accounts as simple folklore becomes intellectually difficult. The testimonies collected by the Philippine Folklore Commission and through community interviews reveal patterns that suggest either genuine encounters with something unexplained or a shared cultural framework so powerful that it generates remarkably consistent hallucinatory experiences across decades and geographic distances. Either possibility demands serious attention. In the province of Samar, in the eastern Visayas, a testimony recorded in 1997 describes an encounter on a forest road connecting two barangays. A woman named Maria de Mano, 32 years old at the time, was returning home after visiting a sick relative in the neighboring village. The hour was late, past 9 in the evening, and she carried a flashlight and a small knife for protection against wild animals. Approximately 2 kilometers from her destination, she heard what she described as an infant's cry coming from the forest to her left, perhaps 20 meters from the path. De Mano's testimony, recorded by a commission researcher, describes her immediate internal conflict. She knew the stories, had been warned since childhood about responding to cries in the forest at night. But the sound was so genuinely distressed, so convincingly an infant in danger, that she found herself unable to simply continue walking. She called out, asking if anyone was there, if someone needed help. The crying intensified in response, becoming more desperate, and she made the decision to investigate, telling herself she would observe from a distance before committing to rescue. She moved into the forest, using her flashlight to navigate between trees, following the sound. The crying seemed to shift position, always staying just ahead, just out of visual range. After several minutes of pursuit, she became aware of 3 things simultaneously. She had traveled much farther from the path than she intended. She could no longer determine the direction back to the road, and the crying had suddenly stopped. In the silence that followed, she heard movement in the undergrowth ahead, something approaching through the darkness. Her testimony describes seeing a shape at the edge of her flashlight beam, low to the ground, that she initially took for a large animal. Then it stood upright, revealing a form roughly the size of a small child, but with proportions that were immediately wrong. De Mano did not wait to see more. She ran, abandoning any attempt to navigate properly, simply fleeing in what she hoped was the direction of the path. Behind her, she heard pursuit, something moving through the forest with disturbing speed. She remembers falling twice, remembers the sound of breathing that was too close, too fast. When she finally broke through onto the road, the pursuit stopped immediately, as if the creature could not or would not follow her onto the maintained path. She reached her village with torn clothing and multiple lacerations from branches and falls, but alive. The incident was documented not only by the Folklore Commission, but by the local barangay captain, who recorded it as an official report. From Mindanao, specifically from the province of Bukidnon, comes a testimony from 2003 involving a farmer named Eduardo Salonga. Salonga's account describes an encounter while checking irrigation channels in rice paddies that bordered forest. The time was dawn, the gray hour before sunrise when mist still covered the fields. He heard crying coming from the tree line and, unlike De Mano, immediately recognized it as potentially dangerous. He did not approach, but instead observed from a distance of approximately 50 meters. His testimony describes seeing what appeared to be an infant lying at the edge of the forest, clearly visible in the growing light. The baby was crying but making no movements, no attempts to roll over or right itself, simply lying motionless except for the opening and closing of its mouth. This unnatural stillness, Salonga reported, convinced him that something was wrong. He remembered his grandfather's advice about the Tiyanak and decided to test the situation. He turned his shirt inside out, a traditional protective measure, and observed what happened next. According to his account, the moment he reversed his clothing, the infant's appearance changed. He described the transformation not as gradual, but instant, as if a veil had been lifted from his perception. What he saw in place of the baby was a small gray figure with elongated limbs, watching him with what he described as obvious awareness and calculation. The two regarded each other across the rice paddy for several seconds before the creature retreated into the forest. Salonga reported the encounter to his community, and several other farmers confirmed they had heard unusual crying from that same forest section over the preceding weeks, but had known better than to investigate. These testimonies share common elements that recur across dozens of similar accounts collected throughout the Visayas and Mindanao. The encounters typically occur during liminal hours, dawn or dusk, in locations that border cultivated land and wilderness. The cry is described consistently as convincing, but possessing subtle wrongness that some witnesses recognize immediately, while others only acknowledge in retrospect. The creature demonstrates intelligence and restraint, pursuing when it believes it can succeed, but withdrawing when confronted with traditional protective measures or when the victim reaches spaces associated with human community. What makes these accounts particularly significant is not any individual testimony, which could be explained through misidentification, psychological stress, or cultural expectation, but the aggregate pattern they create. The descriptions remain consistent across geographic regions, across decades, across witnesses who have no connection to each other. Either there exists an actual entity that operates according to the parameters described in the folklore, or Filipino culture has created such a powerful and specific framework for interpreting ambiguous experiences that it generates identical narratives across the entire archipelago. The social function of these testimonies within rural communities reveals another dimension of the Tiyanak phenomenon. These stories are not told for entertainment or to generate fear for its own sake, but rather serve as community safety protocols disguised as folklore. Parents use Tiyanak accounts to teach children critical survival skills. Do not wander from paths after dark. Do not investigate unusual sounds in isolated areas. Recognize the signs of danger before committing to action. Understand that not everything that appears to need help should be helped. In communities where infrastructure is limited, where police response times can be measured in hours or days, where individuals frequently travel alone through wilderness areas, these narratives provide a compressed form of safety training that is memorable, emotionally resonant, and easily transmitted across generations. The supernatural framework makes the lessons stick in a way that simple prohibition cannot match. A child told not to investigate strange sounds might forget or disobey. A child who knows about the Tiyanak will remember and remain cautious. The testimonies also reveal how communities adapt the mythology to contemporary circumstances while maintaining its core function. Modern accounts include Tiyanak encounters on roads traveled by motorcycles and trucks, not just traditional footpaths. The creatures are reported near cell phone towers and electrical infrastructure, in areas that have been partially developed but still border wilderness. This adaptability suggests the Tiyanak narrative is not static tradition, but living mythology that evolves to remain relevant as the physical and social landscape of the Philippines changes. Researchers who have spent time in these communities report that Tiyanak belief is not universal even within families. Younger generations, particularly those with more urban exposure or higher education, often express skepticism while still acknowledging the power of the stories. But crucially, even skeptics tend to follow the traditional safety protocols, turning clothing inside out when hearing unusual sounds, avoiding investigation of cries in isolated areas, maintaining the behaviors that the mythology was designed to instill, regardless of whether they believe in the literal existence of the creature. This suggests that the truth or falsity of Tiyanak encounters may be less important than the behavioral outcomes they produce. Whether the creature exists as a physical entity or as a cultural construct, it achieves its apparent purpose: keeping people safe in environments where danger is real, even if its source is debatable. The farmer who refuses to investigate a crying sound because of Tiyanak belief is protected not only from potential supernatural threats, but from very real dangers, including wild animals, difficult terrain in darkness, and disorientation that can lead to exposure and death. The voices from Visayas and Mindanao, then, are not simply reporting encounters with a monster, but documenting a complex system of cultural knowledge, transmission, community safety protocols, and adaptive mythology that continues to serve practical purposes in contemporary rural life. These testimonies deserve respect not because they prove the existence of the supernatural, but because they reveal how communities create and maintain systems of protection, how folklore functions as technology, how stories can save lives by encoding essential knowledge in forms that resist forgetting. Against a creature as psychologically sophisticated and physically dangerous as the Tiyanak, Filipino communities have developed over centuries a comprehensive system of protective measures that combine indigenous spiritual practices with imported Catholic ritual, creating a syncretic defense framework that operates on multiple conceptual levels simultaneously. These methods, collectively termed apotropaic practices after the Greek word for warding off evil, represent not merely superstitious responses to fear, but rather sophisticated spiritual technologies that encode practical wisdom about threat assessment, psychological resilience, and the maintenance of boundaries between human and supernatural realms. Understanding these protections reveals as much about Filipino cosmology and cultural logic as it does about the creature they were designed to counter. The most widely known and frequently cited protection against the Tiyanak is the practice of reversing one's clothing, turning shirts, pants, or dresses inside out to break the creature's illusion and reveal its true form. This method appears simple, almost comically mundane given the supernatural threat it supposedly addresses. But its effectiveness within the belief system rests on sophisticated symbolic logic about the relationship between appearance and reality, between surface and truth. The Tiyanak operates through deception, through the presentation of false surfaces that mask malevolent reality. Reversing clothing performs a parallel inversion, turning the outer surface inward and the hidden interior outward, creating a symbolic mirror that reflects the creature's own tactic back upon itself. The practice carries deeper resonance within Filipino spiritual frameworks that emphasize the power of reversal and inversion as mechanisms for breaking enchantments and revealing hidden truths. Clothing in traditional Philippine culture is not merely functional covering, but carries spiritual significance as the boundary between the body and the external world, the membrane that defines where the self ends and the other begins. By inverting this boundary, the practitioner disrupts the normal order of perception, creating a liminal state where they can see things that would otherwise remain hidden. The reversed clothing acts as both shield and lens, protecting the wearer while simultaneously granting vision that penetrates supernatural disguise. Testimonies from rural communities suggest that this method works best when performed before physical contact with the Tiyanak, during the approach phase when the victim still maintains some psychological distance and agency. Once the creature has been picked up, once the transformation has begun, reversing clothing becomes significantly less effective because the deception has already succeeded and the Tiyanak no longer needs to maintain its disguise. This timing requirement reinforces the practical wisdom encoded in the practice. When you hear crying in isolated areas, when you feel the pull of compassion overriding caution, perform the reversal immediately as a diagnostic tool before committing to rescue. If the cry stops or the appearance changes, you know to retreat. If nothing changes, you may proceed with greater confidence, though never with absolute certainty. Catholic protective symbols represent the second major category of defense against the Tiyanak, reflecting 3 centuries of Spanish colonial influence on Filipino spiritual practices. The rosary, blessed by a priest and worn around the neck or carried in a pocket, is believed to create a spiritual barrier that the creature cannot or will not cross. The cross, whether as a pendant, a larger crucifix, or simply formed with 2 fingers, invokes divine protection and marks the bearer as belonging to the Christian community, under the guardianship of saints and angels. Holy water, particularly when obtained from churches during significant feast days, can be sprinkled around dwellings or carried in small vials for emergency use. The effectiveness of these Catholic protections within the belief system derives from their association with baptism, the sacrament that the Tiyanak was denied, and whose absence caused or contributed to its transformation. The rosary and cross are not merely symbols, but condensed forms of prayer, physical objects that carry within them the accumulated spiritual power of countless devotions. They represent the authority of the Church, the power of Christian cosmology to define and limit the supernatural realm, and the protection afforded to those who submit to that authority. For the Tiyanak, which in many versions of the mythology exists specifically as a result of remaining outside the Christian fold, these symbols represent everything it was denied: acceptance into community, salvation, the grace that transforms suffering into meaning. The practical application of Catholic protections reveals interesting tensions in the syncretic belief system. Some accounts suggest these methods work automatically, their mere presence sufficient to repel or reveal the Tiyanak. Others insist that the symbols must be accompanied by genuine faith, by prayers spoken with conviction, by a spiritual state that is itself a form of protection. This distinction separates magical thinking, where objects possess inherent power regardless of context, from religious thinking, where objects serve as conduits for divine intervention that requires human participation. The tension between these interpretations has never been fully resolved, and different communities and individuals emphasize different aspects depending on their relationship to Catholic orthodoxy versus indigenous spiritual traditions. Garlic and salt represent a third category of protection, predating Spanish colonization and deriving from indigenous Filipino spiritual practices that recognize certain substances as inherently antithetical to malevolent supernatural entities. Garlic, worn as necklaces, hung above doorways, or rubbed on the skin, is believed to create an odor or aura that Tiyanaks and other creatures find repulsive. Salt, scattered in lines across thresholds or mixed with water to create protective barriers, operates through different logic, its purity and preservative properties making it spiritually cleansing, capable of neutralizing the corruption that animates supernatural threats. The use of these substances connects to broader Filipino spiritual concepts about pollution and purification, about the kinds of matter that maintain boundaries between the clean and the unclean, the living and the dead, the natural and the supernatural. Salt and garlic are both associated with life and health, with the preservation of food and the prevention of decay. The Tiyanak, as a being born from death or existing in a state between life and death, represents precisely the kind of corruption that these substances were believed to counteract. Their effectiveness is not merely symbolic, but participates in a complete cosmological system where certain materials possess intrinsic properties that affect spiritual as well as physical reality. Prayers for lost souls represent perhaps the most psychologically complex form of protection, operating through entirely different mechanisms than the physical or symbolic methods already discussed. These prayers acknowledge the Tiyanak not merely as a threat to be repelled, but as a tragic figure deserving of compassion, a soul that needs assistance rather than only opposition. The practice involves speaking directly to the creature, acknowledging its suffering, offering prayers that might grant it the peace and passage to the afterlife that it was denied at death. Some versions include the act of naming, giving the nameless spirit the identity that would allow it to finally transcend its earthbound existence. This approach reveals profound sophistication in Filipino spiritual psychology, recognizing that some threats cannot be overcome through force or barriers alone, but require engagement, acknowledgement, and the extension of the very compassion that the creature weaponizes. The logic is that by providing what the Tiyanak actually needs, rather than what it hunts for, by offering genuine spiritual assistance rather than physical vulnerability, you address the root cause of its malevolence and potentially transform it from predator to grateful spirit. This method is notably more dangerous than others because it requires approaching the creature, speaking to it, maintaining presence in its vicinity while performing the ritual, all of which create opportunities for attack if the approach fails. Yet testimonies exist of successful encounters using this method, stories of individuals who confronted Tiyanaks with prayers and naming rituals and survived not through escape, but through the creature's departure after receiving what it needed. These accounts suggest a cosmology where even the most malevolent beings retain some connection to their original human, some capacity to be reached through the proper spiritual approach. The prayers function not as weapons, but as keys, unlocking the prison of the Tiyanak's cursed existence and allowing it to finally move beyond the trauma that created it. The apotropaic arsenal against the Tiyanak then encompasses multiple strategies operating through different logics: inversion and revelation through reversed clothing, divine authority through Catholic symbols, material barriers through garlic and salt, and spiritual transformation through prayers and naming. These methods are not contradictory, but complementary, reflecting different aspects of a comprehensive worldview that recognizes supernatural threats as complex phenomena requiring flexible, multifaceted responses. The practitioner who understands all these methods possesses not just tools for survival, but a complete spiritual technology, a framework for navigating the dangerous boundary between the human world and the realm of entities that should not be, but nevertheless are, crying in the darkness and waiting for the unwary to answer. Beneath the supernatural horror of the Tiyanak lies a profound psychological and cultural truth. This creature is not merely a monster, but a mirror, reflecting back the deepest anxieties that have haunted Filipino communities throughout their history. Anxieties centered on the most fundamental and fraught aspect of human existence: the creation and survival of new life. To understand the Tiyanak's enduring power in Filipino consciousness requires moving beyond the immediate terror of the crying infant and examining what it represents at the level of collective trauma, societal pressure, and the unbearable weight of grief that entire communities have carried for generations. This is where folklore transcends entertainment and becomes something far more essential: a container for emotions too overwhelming to express directly, a language for speaking about suffering that has no adequate words. The historical context of infant and maternal mortality in the Philippines provides the foundation for understanding why the Tiyanak narrative developed with such specificity and emotional intensity. In pre-colonial and colonial periods, before modern medicine, antibiotics, and obstetric care, pregnancy and childbirth represented genuine existential threats to both mother and child. Estimates from historical records and anthropological research suggest that maternal mortality rates in the Philippines prior to the 20th century ranged between 500 and 1,000 deaths per 100,000 live births, meaning that roughly 1 in every 100 to 200 pregnancies resulted in the mother's death. Infant mortality was even more catastrophic, with approximately 30 to 40% of children dying before their 5th birthday, many within the first month of life. These are not merely statistics, but represent an ocean of grief, loss, and trauma that affected virtually every family in every generation. There was no household that had not experienced the death of an infant, no community that had not lost mothers in childbirth, no individual who had not witnessed multiple times the terrible progression from pregnancy to death instead of pregnancy to life. This suffering was ubiquitous, inescapable, and largely inexplicable within the medical frameworks available to pre-modern societies. Women became pregnant, carried children for 9 months, and then either they or their babies or both simply died, often without clear reason, without anyone to blame, without any action that could have prevented the outcome. The psychological impact of this level of mortality cannot be overstated. Every pregnancy carried genuine uncertainty about whether it would result in celebration or tragedy. Every birth involved actual risk that people in developed nations today can barely comprehend. The terror was not abstract but visceral and immediate, reinforced through constant experience. And this terror fell disproportionately on women, who bore not only the physical risks, but the emotional weight of knowing that their own bodies might become the sites of death rather than life, that the creative act of bringing new humans into existence might instead destroy everyone involved. The Tiyanak mythology emerges directly from this context as a way of externalizing and giving form to fears that were too enormous and too constant to process through normal emotional channels. By transforming dead or unbaptized infants into supernatural entities, the folklore creates a framework where these deaths are not simply random tragedies, but events with meaning, with agency, with narrative structure. The infant who died is not merely gone, but continues in altered form, possessing power and purpose even if that purpose is malevolent. This transformation, paradoxically, provides a form of comfort because it suggests that death is not the absolute end, that the child continues to exist in some capacity, and that the relationship between parent and child persists even across the boundary of mortality. But the Tiyanak narrative does more than simply acknowledge death. It encodes specific forms of guilt and anxiety that accompanied infant mortality in Filipino society. The creature's association with unbaptized infants directly reflects the Catholic Church's teachings about original sin and the necessity of baptism for salvation, doctrines that placed enormous pressure on parents to ensure their children receive the sacrament as quickly as possible after birth. For families living in remote areas, for children born prematurely or in medical distress, for situations where a priest could not be summoned in time. This pressure created an impossible situation where parental love and duty collided with practical limitations and circumstances beyond anyone's control. When an infant died unbaptized, parents faced not only the grief of loss, but the additional burden of believing their child's soul was condemned to limbo, excluded from heaven, separated from God and from the family members who would eventually achieve salvation. This theological framework transformed natural tragedy into spiritual catastrophe and placed responsibility squarely on the parents who had failed for whatever reason, to perform the necessary ritual in time. The Tiyanak mythology reflects and amplifies this guilt, suggesting that the consequences of failing to baptize extend beyond the afterlife into the present world, that the unbaptized dead become actively dangerous to the living, that parental failure creates monsters that then victimize others. The modern extension of Tiyanak mythology to include aborted fetuses adds another layer of meaning that speaks to contemporary anxieties about reproductive choice, bodily autonomy, and the moral status of potential life. In a predominantly Catholic nation where abortion remains heavily stigmatized and largely illegal, the narrative of vengeful aborted fetuses returning as Tiyanaks functions as both moral judgment and psychological projection of guilt. Women who have terminated pregnancies, whether by choice or circumstance, face not only legal and social consequences, but internalized terror that their decision has created a supernatural entity that seeks their destruction. This version of the mythology transforms the Tiyanak from a symbol of random tragedy into a tool of moral enforcement, a weapon that conservative religious and social forces can deploy to police women's reproductive decisions. Yet even this punitive interpretation reveals underlying compassion for the profound difficulty and pain of these situations. The Tiyanak that seeks revenge is also the Tiyanak that was denied life, the potential child that never received the opportunity to exist. By giving these terminated pregnancies supernatural form and agency, the mythology acknowledges that abortion involves genuine loss, that potential life carries weight and meaning even when it is not brought to term, that women who make these decisions do so with full knowledge of what they are ending. The monster becomes a repository for ambivalence, a way of holding simultaneously the validity of the choice and the grief of the loss. The Tiyanak's specific targeting of women, particularly mothers and women of childbearing age, further emphasizes its function as a mirror for maternal anxiety. The creature attacks precisely those who would most strongly feel compulsion to rescue an infant, who cannot ignore the cry because their entire identity and social role centers on protecting and nurturing children. This creates a terrible bind where women must choose between maternal instinct and self-preservation, where the very quality that defines them as good mothers, their inability to ignore a child in distress, becomes the mechanism of their victimization. The mythology thus externalizes the internal conflict that many mothers experience, the tension between self-sacrifice for children and maintenance of one's own survival and well-being. The communal function of Tiyanak stories in rural Filipino communities demonstrates how folklore serves as collective therapy, a way of processing shared trauma through narrative structures that make the unbearable somewhat more bearable. When communities gather and tell Tiyanak stories, they are not merely entertaining each other, but engaging in a form of ritual acknowledgement of grief, creating space where the deaths of infants and mothers can be discussed indirectly, where the terror of pregnancy can be expressed through metaphor, where the guilt of survival can be examined through the framework of supernatural threat. The stories allow communities to say things that would be too painful or too socially unacceptable to state directly. That pregnancy is terrifying, that sometimes we resent the demands children place on us, that maternal love is not always pure and selfless, but is mixed with fear and anger and ambivalence. The persistence of Tiyanak belief into the modern era, even as medical technology has dramatically reduced infant and maternal mortality rates, suggests that the creature continues to serve psychological and cultural functions that transcend its original context. Contemporary Filipino society still grapples with questions about reproductive rights, about the value and status of fetal life, about maternal responsibility and sacrifice, about how to process pregnancy loss and infant death in a culture that often demands constant cheerfulness and forward momentum. The Tiyanak provides a culturally specific language for engaging with these issues. A mythology that acknowledges darkness and complexity without requiring explicit articulation of feelings that remain largely taboo. The Tiyanak, then, is grief given form, anxiety made flesh, guilt transformed into something that can be fought or fled or negotiated with. It is the shadow side of motherhood, the terror that accompanies creation, the knowledge that bringing life into the world always involves risk of bringing death instead. And by making this shadow visible, by giving it name and characteristics and behavioral patterns, Filipino culture has created a tool for survival, a way of living with unbearable knowledge. A mirror that reflects our darkest fears while simultaneously demonstrating that we are not alone in experiencing them. That these fears are so universal and so profound that they have taken supernatural form in the collective imagination of an entire people. The Tiyanak has made a journey that few folkloric entities successfully complete. The transition from oral tradition, whispered in rural villages, to mass media phenomenon projected on screens both large and small, streamed through digital platforms and consumed by audiences who may never set foot in a Philippine forest, but who nevertheless find themselves haunted by the image of a crying infant that transforms into nightmare. This evolution from folklore to popular culture represents not dilution or corruption of the original myth, but rather its adaptation and revitalization. Proof that the psychological core of the Tiyanak narrative remains potent enough to transcend its original context and speak to contemporary anxieties in forms that modern audiences recognize and consume. The creature has become a cultural export, a distinctly Filipino contribution to global horror iconography that carries with it centuries of accumulated meaning, even as it takes on new interpretations. The Tiyanak's first major appearance in Philippine cinema came in 1958 with a film that bore the creature's name as its title. Part of a wave of horror productions that emerged during the golden age of Filipino film. This early cinematic treatment established visual and narrative conventions that would persist through subsequent decades. The isolated protagonist, the forest setting, the audio-centric horror of the cry, and the transformation sequence that served as the film's centerpiece of practical effects and makeup artistry. The 1950s Tiyanak was presented within a framework that respected the folklore's Catholic elements, positioning the creature as explicitly demonic and emphasizing baptism and religious faith as protective mechanisms, reflecting the conservative social values of the era and the enormous influence that the church still wielded over Philippine cultural production. The 1980s and 1990s saw a resurgence of Tiyanak-focused films that reflected the broader development of Filipino horror cinema as a commercially viable and artistically ambitious genre. Films from this period began experimenting with the mythology, introducing variations that expanded the creature's origin stories and behavioral patterns, while maintaining the core elements that made it recognizable. The Tiyanak appeared not only as the primary threat, but as one entity within larger supernatural ecosystems that included other Filipino folkloric creatures, creating shared universes decades before that concept became dominant in Western cinema. These films often featured explicit social commentary, using the Tiyanak narrative to explore issues of poverty, rural-urban migration, the breakdown of traditional communities, and the tension between modernization and cultural preservation. The visual representation of the Tiyanak evolved significantly across these decades as makeup effects technology advanced and filmmakers gained access to better resources and training. Early depictions relied on relatively simple prosthetics and lighting tricks to suggest the transformation, maintaining much of the horror off-screen or in shadow, trusting audience imagination to fill in the gaps. Later films presented increasingly elaborate and graphic transformation sequences, showing in visceral detail the morphing of infant flesh into gray skin, the extension of claws, the bulging of eyes, the revelation of teeth. This shift from suggestion to explicit display reflects broader changes in horror cinema globally, but also represents a kind of cultural negotiation about how much of the traditional mystery should be preserved versus how much should be revealed to satisfy contemporary audience expectations for visual spectacle. Television provided another platform for Tiyanak narratives, particularly through anthology series that featured different folkloric entities each episode or each season. These television treatments often had more freedom to explore psychological and emotional dimensions that film's compressed time frame could not accommodate. Developing extended narratives that examine the Tiyanak not merely as monster, but as tragic figure, sometimes even as protagonist, whose perspective the audience was invited to inhabit. Television episodes frequently incorporated contemporary social issues more explicitly than theatrical films, addressing abortion directly in some cases, exploring parental abandonment in others, using the Tiyanak as a lens through which to examine failures of social safety nets and community care structures. The 21st century has seen the Tiyanak migrate into new media forms that previous generations could not have imagined. Web series and streaming platform productions have freed Filipino creators from some of the content restrictions and commercial pressures that shaped theatrical and broadcast releases, allowing for darker, more experimental treatments that push boundaries of what the Tiyanak narrative can express. Some of these productions have achieved international distribution, introducing global audiences to Filipino folklore and contributing to growing recognition of Southeast Asian horror as a distinct aesthetic and narrative tradition, with its own logic, its own fears, its own monsters that operate according to different rules than Western or East Asian horror conventions. Graphic novels and comic books have provided yet another medium for Tiyanak stories, one particularly well suited to the creature's visual transformation and to the atmospheric rendering of Philippine landscapes. The static image allows for detailed examination of the Tiyanak's appearance that film's motion does not permit, while sequential art's control of pacing can build tension through careful page layout and panel design in ways that create reading experiences distinct from both prose and film. Filipino comic artists have used the Tiyanak in stories ranging from faithful folklore adaptations to radical reimaginings that place the creature in fiction settings, urban environments, even historical periods, demonstrating the mythology's flexibility and its capacity to generate meaning in diverse contexts. Video games represent the most recent frontier for Tiyanak narratives, transforming the creature from object of passive consumption to active threat that players must recognize and counter. The interactive of gaming creates unique opportunities for deploying the Tiyanak's deceptive unbaptized, where player choice about whether to investigate crying becomes mechanically consequential, where protective methods from folklore become gameplay mechanics that must be mastered for survival. Filipino game developers have created both horror titles where the Tiyanak serves as enemy or antagonist, and more nuanced narrative games that explore the creature's origins and invite players to consider its perspective, using the medium's capacity for branching narratives and moral choice systems to examine the ethical dimensions that folklore addresses through metaphor. Social media and digital storytelling platforms have democratized Tiyanak narrative production, allowing individuals to share their own interpretations, supposed encounters, creative reimaginings, and analytical essays examining the creature from various theoretical perspectives. Channels dedicated to Philippine folklore regularly feature Tiyanak content, some presenting educational material about the mythology's history and cultural significance, others offering dramatized encounters styled as true stories or found footage. Still others analyzing the creature through lenses of psychology, sociology, and comparative mythology. These digital treatments often incorporate production values and narrative sophistication that rival professional media, demonstrating how contemporary technology has enabled a new generation of folklore transmission that combines oral traditions' participatory with visual media's emotional impact. The Tiyanak has also appeared in Philippine popular music, referenced in song lyrics that range from straightforward horror narratives to metaphorical uses of the creature as symbol for betrayal, false appearances, or relationships that begin with sweetness but reveal toxicity. Music videos have provided visual interpretations that contribute to the evolving iconography of how the Tiyanak appears and behaves, creating images that circulate through social media and become part of the collective visual vocabulary that Filipinos use when discussing or imagining the creature. This proliferation across media platforms and genres has created a situation where the Tiyanak exists simultaneously in multiple versions, each serving different purposes and speaking to different audiences. The traditional village folklore version persists in rural communities, transmitted through oral tradition and lived experience. The cinematic versions circulate through film festivals and streaming services, introducing the creature to urban Filipino audiences and international viewers. The literary and comic versions allow for deeper psychological exploration and formal experimentation. The digital versions enable participatory culture where audiences become creators, generating their own Tiyanak content and interpretations. What remains consistent across all these adaptations and reimaginings is the core psychological mechanism that makes the Tiyanak effective. The weaponization of compassion through the image of an infant in distress, the transformation from innocence to horror, the exploitation of our deepest instincts toward protection and care. This consistency suggests that however much the specific details and contexts change, the fundamental anxieties that the Tiyanak addresses remain relevant. That contemporary Filipinos still grapple with questions about parenthood, about loss, about the relationship between appearance and reality, about when compassion becomes dangerous and how to maintain humanity in a world that punishes kindness. The Tiyanak's success in popular culture has also created feedback loops where media representations influence how people in rural communities describe their encounters and understand the folklore, where film versions become canonical in ways that shape subsequent oral tradition. This bidirectional flow between media and folklore prevents the mythology from becoming static museum piece and keeps it alive as dynamic cultural force that continues evolving in response to changing social conditions and new forms of expression. The creature that cries in contemporary films is both ancient and modern, both traditional and innovative, both preservation of cultural heritage and active creation of new meaning for new generations. We return now to where this journey began. A forest path in the Philippine provinces, the hour when darkness claims the world and the boundary between what is and what should not be grows thin as breath. You stand in that liminal space, and in the distance, carried through mist and silence, you hear it again. The cry, that terrible, perfect imitation of infant distress that has haunted Filipino consciousness for centuries, that has claimed countless victims, that continues even now to echo through rural areas where the old knowledge persists and where people still understand that some sounds, no matter how compelling, must not be answered. This is the sound that never leaves. The cry that persists not merely in folklore or film, but in the deeper chambers of cultural memory, in the place where collective trauma transforms into myth. and myth becomes the language through which we speak about things too painful for ordinary words. The Tiyanak, as we have seen through this exploration, is not one thing but many things simultaneously. It is the vengeful spirit of the unbaptized dead, denied salvation and seeking to drag others into the darkness it inhabits. It is the cautionary guardian that teaches survival protocols to communities where danger is real and constant, where children must learn early that compassion without wisdom leads to death. It is the repository of maternal grief, the container for centuries of loss and trauma associated with pregnancy, childbirth, and infant mortality. It is a tool of colonial religious control, weaponized by the Catholic Church to enforce orthodoxy and baptismal compliance. It is entertainment, horror cinema's reliable source of psychological terror and transformation spectacle. It is all of these things and more. A creature so rich in meaning and so flexible in interpretation that it continues to generate new understandings with each generation that encounters it. But beneath all these interpretations, beneath the theological frameworks and the psychological analyses and the cultural commentary, the Tiyanak represents something even more fundamental: the personification of impossible choices, the embodiment of situations where every option leads to tragedy and where moral action cannot be separated from moral failure. When you hear that cry in the forest, you face a decision that has no good answer. If you investigate and it is a real infant, you are a hero who saved a life. But if you investigate and it is a Tiyanak, you die, and your compassion is revealed as fatal weakness. If you ignore the cry and it is a Tiyanak, you survive. But if you ignore the cry and it is a real infant, you become complicit in the death of an innocent and must carry that burden for the rest of your life. This is the genius of the Tiyanak mythology. It forces confrontation with the reality that virtue and survival are not always compatible, that in a dangerous world, the qualities that make us admirable as humans, compassion, selflessness, willingness to help the vulnerable, can become the mechanisms of our destruction. The creature asks us an unanswerable question. What kind of person do you want to be when being a good person might get you killed? Do you value survival above all else? Or do you value the moral framework that makes survival meaningful? And if you choose safety over compassion consistently enough, at what point do you stop being human in any sense that matters? Philippine culture, through the Tiyanak narrative, acknowledges this impossible dilemma without offering false comfort or easy answers. The folklore does not suggest that there is a simple protocol for distinguishing real infants from Tiyanaks with absolute certainty. Does not promise that virtue will always be rewarded or that caution will always save you. Instead, it presents the world as fundamentally tragic, a place where grief is inevitable, and where the boundary between victim and predator can shift in the space of a heartbeat. This tragic worldview is not pessimism, but rather clear-eyed realism born from centuries of lived experience in circumstances where death was constant companion and where survival required accepting that loss could not always be prevented or explained. The relationship between Filipinos and death that the Tiyanak reveals is complex and nuanced, shaped by the intersection of indigenous animist beliefs and imported Catholic doctrine, by historical experiences of colonization and violence, by environmental conditions that made life precarious and death familiar. There is no denial of mortality in this mythology, no pretense that faith or goodness provides immunity from tragedy. Instead, there is acknowledgement that death is woven into the fabric of existence, that it takes forms both natural and supernatural, that it must be respected and negotiated with rather than simply opposed. The Tiyanak is not an aberration in this worldview, but a natural consequence of the way death operates when proper rituals are not completed, when souls become trapped between states, when grief is so enormous that it cannot be contained by the living and must find expression through the dead. The liminal spaces where the Tiyanak hunts are both geographic and metaphysical. Physically, they are the borders between cultivated land and wilderness, between village and forest, between the spaces shaped by human intention and the spaces that resist that shaping. Metaphysically, they are the boundaries between life and death, between innocence and experience, between compassion and self-preservation, between the world as we want it to be and the world as it actually is. These liminal zones are dangerous precisely because they resist simple categorization, because the rules that govern ordered space do not fully apply, because identities become fluid and appearances become unreliable. The Tiyanak thrives in these spaces because it is itself a liminal being, neither fully alive nor fully dead, neither innocent infant nor simple monster, neither victim nor villain, but somehow both simultaneously. Human compassion, in the Tiyanak narrative, is revealed as both our greatest strength and our most exploitable vulnerability. This is perhaps the most profound and disturbing insight the mythology offers, that the very quality that allows human civilization to exist, our capacity to care for others and respond to suffering, creates an opening that malevolent forces can penetrate. We cannot simply harden our hearts and ignore all cries for help without ceasing to be recognizably human, without destroying the social bonds that make collective survival possible. Yet remaining open to those cries means remaining vulnerable to manipulation, to deception, to attacks that exploit the best parts of our. The Tiyanak asks us to live with this vulnerability consciously, to accept that compassion involves risk and that risk sometimes results in tragedy. The protective protocols preserved in folklore, reversing clothing, carrying religious symbols, using salt and garlic, offering prayers, provide some mitigation of danger, but no guarantee of safety. They are tools for navigation rather than shields against all harm, ways of reducing risk while acknowledging that risk cannot be eliminated entirely. This is the wisdom of a people who survived centuries of hardship, not by denying danger, but by developing sophisticated strategies for living alongside it, for maintaining humanity while also maintaining vigilance. As we conclude this exploration, we return one final time to that forest path, to the sound of crying that echoes through the darkness. You hear it now with different understanding, knowing its history and its meanings, recognizing the layers of tragedy and manipulation and cultural wisdom encoded in that sound. And the question remains, what will you do? The Tiyanak mythology does not prescribe a single answer because there is no single answer that works for all circumstances. Sometimes the cry must be answered. Sometimes it must be ignored. And sometimes, despite our best judgment and our deepest knowledge, we choose wrong and must live with or die from the consequences. This is the sound that never leaves. Not merely the physical cry echoing through Philippine forests, but the psychological and spiritual resonance of impossible choices, of grief too large for words, of the recognition that being human means being vulnerable, and that vulnerability is both what makes us worth protecting and what makes us possible to destroy. The Tiyanak persists in Filipino consciousness because these truths persist, because the circumstances that created the mythology, high mortality, uncertain survival, the need to balance compassion and caution, remain relevant even as their specific forms change. The creature adapts because the anxieties it addresses adapt. finding new expressions for each generation while maintaining the core insight that some dangers wear the face of innocence and some cries, no matter how genuine they sound, lead only to darkness. Before we part ways, I need you to take action. If this journey through the shadow side of Philippine folklore has moved you, if you have found value in this exploration of the Tiyanak and what it reveals about fear, grief, and the human condition, then subscribe to this channel right now. Do not simply appreciate this content passively. Commit to being part of this community that preserves and examines cultural knowledge, that refuses to let these stories disappear into forgotten history. Hit that notification bell so you never miss future explorations of folklore, mythology, and the monsters that reveal who we are as humans. And most importantly, engage in the comments. Tell me about the folklore from your own culture that serves similar functions, that encodes wisdom about danger and survival, that uses supernatural horror to address very human fears. Share your experiences if you have heard cries in isolated places and had to make the terrible choice about whether to investigate. Your voice matters in this ongoing conversation about how we understand and preserve cultural memory. Subscribe, comment, share this video with others who appreciate the intersection of folklore, psychology, and cultural analysis. And then, join me for the next exploration. Because there are more creatures waiting in the darkness, more stories that demand to be told, more wisdom encoded in the monsters that our ancestors created to help us survive. The forest is deep, the night is long, and there are many more cries to investigate before we can rest.